Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce to you Laura Amico, who is one of the founders, along with her husband Chris, of Homicide Watch DC. Homicide Watch DC is a community-based, data-driven website documenting violent crime in the nation's capital. The project, which was started in 2010 and relaunched in 2011, seeks to record every single homicide that is committed in Washington, D.C., using original reporting, submissions from community members, and an innovative digital strategy. Laura brings a unique set of experiences and accolades to the project. She has reported for the Register
Pajaronian.
Pajaronian
That's a tough one.
and the Press Democrat in California. She's also been the recipient of the New York Times Chairman's Award, and she has held fellowships in the Guggenheim Symposium on Crime in America, as well as the Online News Association. She's also a former fellow at the she is a Night News Entrepreneur Boot Camp alum, and she's also now currently a Nieman Fellow. Homicide Watch is premised on the idea that it matters tremendously how people die and how their deaths are recognized and remembered. Laura has brought this topic to the forefront of her site using an innovative approach that we all as journalists can learn from. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Laura. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good morning. So I am the scary crime reporter who spends all my time covering homicides. I promise it's a lot more fun than that. This is a presentation on building digital beats. And the first thing that I want all of you to know is that we are not going to talk about technology and we are not going to talk about tools. The reason is because how you use tools and the decisions that you make in how you use tools is more important than the tools that you actually use. The tools that you use today aren't the tools that you're going to be using next year. So I think it's more important to think about how you make the decisions in building your beat and how you're thinking about it going forward. So what I'm hoping to provide here for you today is a bit of a toolkit on how to ask the right questions when you're thinking about building your digital beats. I'm going to start with Homicide Watch DC because that's where my experience is, as Rebecca told you. We started Homicide Watch DC, Chris and I, with this idea that there wasn't enough meaningful coverage of crime in Washington, D.C. We were new to the district. We'd moved from California, where I'd been a crime reporter. And Chris had been hired by PBS NewsHour. I thought it would be pretty easy to get a job as a crime reporter in DC. I was wrong. I spent a year unemployed, doing freelance work, and really hating what I was doing, which was mostly covering the public broadcasting industry for a trade publication. I loved crime reporting, so I was reading what was happening, in my neighborhood around me, where people were being killed. And I wanted to understand who my new neighbors were, what was happening in their lives, and what was happening in these very intimate, traumatic moments in my neighborhood. And there just wasn't that coverage. And I thought, there might be a way for us to do this better. So the editorial question that we asked was, can we cover homicides in a way that's meaningful to the community, that answers their questions, and provides the tools to communicate with one another about what's happening? So that was our editorial question. The next part of the project, I didn't have the words for this at the time, but it was really thinking about the community mission. And this is something that I think that we don't think about enough in journalism. The community mission is what the community needs from you as the publication. So this is identifying what their needs are. Sometimes the community just needs information. Sometimes they need to know what's coming up next. Traditionally, newsrooms have done this with community calendars, though we see fewer and fewer of those over time. Sometimes it's providing a place for people to connect with one another. And we see this online a lot in message boards, things like Reddit, perhaps, or even the Discuss forum. I mentioned tools, and I apologize, but those are examples of where we see the application of these community missions. So with those two ideas, the editorial concept and the community mission, we launched Homicide Watch DC. This is a screenshot from just yesterday, I think. Now, this is not what the site looked like when we launched, and I want to stress that. We launched as a very ugly WordPress site that I built myself with absolutely no experience on the web. I really never looked at WordPress before. And Chris came home from work one night and I said, so I launched Homicide Watch DC and I did it on WordPress. And he said, okay. But Chris is a software developer, and over the next year, as I was going through the reporting process, learning about what I was doing and thinking about it, we talked about building this platform, which is what you see now. Across the top there, you see the tools for the community. That victims link at the top goes to a list of all of the victims. Suspects the same. Map, of course, shows you a map of where the homicides are. Photos is a photo gallery of all of our victims. Documents library puts all of our reporting online, all of the court documents that we're gathering, and it makes them available to the public, because I firmly believe that the tools that the reporter has to understand a story should be made available to our community as well, because the community wants to understand the story as much as the reporter does. Calendar, as I mentioned earlier, people are really interested in what happens next. On a crime beat, what happens next is often a court date. So we make our calendar of the court dates public. Again, putting those tools in the community's hands to help them understand the story along with us. Most important tool on this website is one that's very low tech, and that is our comments policy. In journalism, you all know how important this is. Our comments policy states that you are not allowed to use foul language or make threats, and that we will not edit your comment. We do pre-moderate all comments on Homicide Watch DC, and that is because we are dealing with a subject matter where people will make personal threats, where people will use foul language. And we try to promote good behavior on the site by not allowing bad behavior to be present on it. Over time, the community has understood this, and we now approve nearly 100% of comments, which I think is a really strong testament to how comments policies can work. The photos along the top there are the most recent homicide victims in DC for whom we have photos. Each of those photos clicks to a unique and individual page for that case. This is important because people come into Homicide Watch DC by searching names, and they're not always names that we know. They put in JoJo was killed 14th Street into Google, and they land on Homicide Watch DC. When we have a place for them to land, when we have a page for JoJo, they'll keep coming back again and again. And this becomes a community tool as well, because they know over time that this place is always there and that it will always have the most up-to-date information. So how did we get here? Like I said when I started, it wasn't about the tools. It started simply on WordPress. But it was about asking the right questions. And the first part of that was finding our editorial focus. This presentation is online, and in your resources for this presentation on the website, you have all of these questions. But these are the questions that Chris and I start with now whenever we think about projects like Homicide Watch. These are not questions about tools, remember. They are questions about what's interesting. And what's interesting is often the best place to start. When you're thinking about your editorial focus, if you think about what's interesting to you, you can start to dig into what might be interesting for your community. The follow-up to that, of course, is what do you want to know? This is about what's missing from your information right now and where you'd like to dig more. Knowing where people are already having this conversation is really important, because why replicate work that's already being done? And finally, you want to think about your audience. Who cares about this? And beyond who cares about this, why do they care about this? When you start thinking about these questions, you help start to develop how you can think about the questions you want to answer going forward. Technology. Again, this isn't about tools, but thinking about your approach. You want to think about where your beat would work. What communities specifically? And the mistake that we make so often is defining community by location. And I want to encourage you instead to think about the people that you want your beat to address. If your beat is sports, do you want to address fans or people who aren't coming to games, perhaps, or the athletes themselves? The more you can define where this would work and who this beat would work for, you begin to narrow in on what you want to do. You want to know what information is available publicly already. What resources can you pull in that will help make your reporting better and help make your life as a reporter easier? Again, this is another technology question, but where are people talking about this already? If they're talking about it on Yelp, if you're a restaurant reviewer, maybe you want to plug into Yelp and see how you can use that resource and that tool and pull some of that community onto your own site and use those resources that are already there. Finally, and this is, I think, where our biggest breakthrough happened with Homicide Watch DC, was thinking about what all of the parts are that are involved in your coverage. The term that I use for this is units of coverage. So in a homicide, we have a victim, a suspect, and a crime. And those are three unique things. Break apart your beats that same way. Think about what all the units of coverage are for your beats. And then think about how to best address those within the structure of your reporting. The goal for us on Homicide Watch DC was to get to 100% coverage, because what the community needed from us, back to that editorial mission, was a full picture of what was happening in our community. And the more you can get to 100% coverage, the closer you can get to 100% coverage, the more the community follows along with you. And they spot where your holes are. And they begin to say, you're missing this victim or this suspect. And then they help you with the reporting, which makes your job easier over time. So, 3 big takeaways from this presentation. Again, these aren't about tools, but they're about approaching your beat. The first one, to me, is be thoughtful. Know how you're making your decisions and why. Be organized. Think about those units of coverage. Think about where people are already getting their information. Think about who you're targeting and who your audience is. And finally, be accountable. Remember what I just said about 100% coverage and people coming to you when they see that something is missing? That's being accountable. That's saying, I make this promise to you that I will cover this beat, that I will build this beat around your needs, and that we're in this together, that we're sharing this information and building this beat together as a community, me as the reporter and you as the audience. And that together we're going to provide this coverage. I think that beat reporting is some of the best reporting you can do. I started as a beat reporter on the education beat because just out of undergraduate with a minor in journalism, that's what most small papers put new reporters on. And my favorite moments were going to the school board meetings, going to the schools, talking to the teachers, to the students, and trying to understand the framework of this world that people were living in. Later, when I moved to the crime beat, I fell in love with it all over again because I was trying to understand again the framework of the world that the detectives, that the victims, that the suspects, that their families and friends and neighbors and coworkers were living in. And I find it exhilarating that my job is to explain that world and make that framework more visible. With Homicide Watch DC, what we've built is a visual representation of that framework and that world that brings the community in and provides them with the tools to help us understand it better. To share with the community the worlds that we're living in and what we want them to know about it. And I think that beat reporting at its most successful makes that framework visible. We have a couple minutes, so I'm happy to take as many questions as we can get through. Yeah?
Is Homicide Watch DC like a totally nonprofit?
Business model, good
Yeah.
question. No, we're actually a for-profit. We license the underlying software of Homicide Watch DC. So we run Homicide Watch Trenton in partnership with the Trentonian and Homicide Watch Chicago in partnership with the Sun-Times. We're hoping to launch a couple more over the next few months. But our business model for Glass Eye Media, which is the company, is to license that software.
Cool.
Yeah. Yes?
Laura, I wonder if you could talk about, especially for this group, the college students, how do you know where there's a missing beat? It's just not being reported. Obviously, you lived in DC, you had some time, you saw that there was a need.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering for people on campus, how can they try to figure out where the gaps are and find the holes?
I think that reporters often forget that they're a part of the community. What do you miss? What aren't you finding out? What are you curious about? This is how we started Homicide Watch DC. There were 17 crime reporters in the Washington Post newsroom when we launched Homicide Watch. It wasn't that there wasn't coverage, but there was this hole. And we identified the hole because we were curious, because there felt like there was something missing. If you don't feel like there's something missing, there probably still is. Start asking around. Ask your friends, ask people in the dining halls. What are you curious about? What would you like to know? What's going on that you don't understand? And these are the questions that can help start to identify those holes. Over time, I think, you ask those questions to, 3, 4, 10, 12 people, you might start hearing similar things. And then you start to know that you have maybe a new beat that you can begin to develop. Yeah.
Recycling?
Do you have one right here? Yeah.
So the sort of crime that a campus paper deals with is going to tend to be less severe, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And going after wrongdoers can come off being mean-spirited, and it's hard. Like, the incentives are a little weird because you don't want to be, sort of profiting off other people's suffering.
Sure.
So how do you balance that sort of, and maybe part of it is like how you focus on, the victims of the homicides and not the perpetrators. How do you balance sort of aligning your incentives in an ethical way when you're covering ugly things?
So I would go back to this editorial question. What are you trying to do? What is important for people to know about crime on campus? I think that thinking about it in those terms helps you get to that point where you can begin to understand what should we be covering. But you have to ask the question first about what is important in our editorial focus. What is the question that we're trying to answer? Maybe that question is the campus safe? Or, is the campus safe at night? Is the campus safe for women at night? The more you can begin to narrow that down, the better your questions are. Report on your beat. And I don't mean do the beat reporting, but ask questions of your coverage. What service is this providing? What service does the community need it to do? And sometimes that service is actually knowing who the perpetrators are, because understanding that can be key to how safe we feel, and understanding what happens to crime on campus, how it's prosecuted, how it moves forward, can be very central to how safe people feel, which could be an editorial question that you're trying to answer. Does that answer your question? Sure. Chris, come on up. Chris is our co-founder of Homicide Watch, as Rebecca mentioned, and built the platform that we are on. We are married, which I can recommend and not recommend working on a project with your spouse. We actually met in our college newsroom senior year, and here we are today.
Woo!
So if anybody has questions about how to apply this approach to the technical side of a newsroom, the structure of the platform, the workflow, I'm happy to pick up on that as well. But these are the important questions.
Chris, could you just give a brief overview of how you, what your technical background is? And
Right.
for people who don't have a lot of technical expertise, where they might turn to get some really good tools and to get started?
So I should start off by saying that I began my career as a reporter. Our college newspaper that we both worked at did not have a website when we graduated back in 2004, just starting to be a long time ago. And I went to a small newspaper in California that at this point basically doesn't have a website either. It puts a few headlines online, and then when you click through it says go buy the print newspaper. And I was an education reporter, and I was really interested in answering systemic questions. Why is this school always failing? What does failure actually mean? Like, not just in their test scores, but what are their students missing out on? And to answer those questions, you need to start, you can't just go and ask three people and write a story. You need to start looking at data. You need to start looking at big trends over time. So I started looking at things like the vastly changing demographics of the Antelope Valley in California, or things like, when a school is failing, it doesn't just mean that it does bad on tests. It means that in a class of 500, 19 graduates have the prerequisites to go to college. Not 19%, 19. That's a bad thing. I started learning programming in part because it let me answer some of those questions, and it let me ask different questions. So I learned a framework called, a language called Python and a framework called Django. I'm entirely self-taught. You can take classes. There are good classes here and online. There are also really good books. So if you take the time, you really can learn this stuff. And it's not terribly hard. When we started working on Homicide Watch, we spent a lot of time on these questions, and one of the things that we did
These questions.
We spent a lot of time in that first year just talking about what we were covering. What did we know? When did we know it? How those pieces of information fit together. And I started trying to, in some ways, translate the court system into code and into structure. So we know, for example, that a homicide has a time and a place, that it has a victim, that it might have a suspect, or it might not. but that victim has a name, age, race, gender, date of birth, date of death. That suspect has all of those things plus an arrest date. We know that we get a certain number of court documents. We know that the court moves in a very systemic way, in a structured way. The cases always move through the court system in the same ways. And so this, eventually we started seeing this very regular pattern of events, these structures. And that's the thing that we can build around. We can turn that into software. Does that answer your question? So the way to think about it is not in terms of, I try to stay away from recommending particular programming language and particular tools for people, but if you can start to see this structure, it becomes much easier to turn that into a digital beat.
And remember that you can start asking and answering these questions in print or on WordPress. You don't need to do it with any software or developing or any extra tools, though you can, but you can begin doing it when you're writing your print stories or when you're publishing to the web on WordPress or whatever your CMS is. And it's possible to start today. Yeah.
Are you guys affiliated with any newspaper in DC, or are you totally independent? Yeah.
We're independent in DC.
So how did you choose to be affiliated with newspapers in other places?
When we looked at how we could pay the rent, which we didn't do with this project for 2 years, we didn't see much of a future in running the DC site by ourselves. Instead, we said, okay, well, we actually have this product. And who's this product useful for? Well, it's useful to other journalists who keep asking us, how can I do what you do on Homicide Watch DC? Well, okay, if we give them that product and they give us money, maybe we can pay rent, right? We're still working on that. It's a slow process, but it's moving in the right direction. The DC site financially is still a struggle. We ran a Kickstarter campaign when I got the fellowship here, and we raised $47,000 to pay interns to run the site while we're here in Cambridge, and that's worked out really great. We had a grad student at American. He's been the site editor for this school year. An Air Force vet who's in online journalism school as a reporter who's doing fantastic. And then a Medill undergrad, recent graduate, who was on the site for several months and was hired by the Chronicle for Higher Education. And then we replaced him with a senior from Georgetown. So the students have been doing great. What's really worked out well about having this framework for them is that it provided sort of a training ground for them to say, okay, there are certain things I need when I cover a homicide. I need a name, age, race, gender, location, time, date. So it's really guided them through that reporting process because we thought about the reporting process when we structured the beat. That $47,000 runs out at the end of September, which will be, the 1 year anniversary of that funding. And we don't have a solution for what happens next for the DC site. It is overwhelmingly disappointing that there is no news organization in DC that's willing to do this type of coverage, despite the fact that there are news organizations across the country that want to do this. We lived in DC, so we started in DC. I love doing this coverage in DC, so we'll see what happens.
We could really use you guys in New Haven.
We love it. Actually, New Haven is one of the first cities we actually looked at expanding to, and there were just different, structural issues with some news organizations that didn't make it happen, but they would be terrific. Plus, we'd eat pizza. Yeah.
What was your college newspaper?
City on a Hill Press in UC Santa Cruz. It's a weekly.
Anyone know it? No. One! Yay!
I'm a California girl though,
Yeah.
so.
I started as a reporter on our world desk, and then I was world desk editor, and then, local editor,
No,
World
city
editor, city editor, managing editor.
Yeah. And I started on the campus desk as a writer and then as an editor. And then I did study abroad in Italy for a quarter and then came back and was state and national editor. And then I hated that, and so I went back to the campus desk. And then I think I was the health editor and like an editor at large my last quarter.
So, just to close up here, I will say one thing, we've identified ourselves as California kids, right? Like, we come from the West Coast, and we land in DC, and I'm a crime reporter, and I want to cover homicides. You saw the front of Homicide Watch DC. Let's see if we can swing back to it. Homicide in DC overwhelmingly affects young black men. This is not who I am. So asking those editors, right? So how do I get beyond that? And how do I really dig deep into finding out, becoming an authority for this beat and for this subject? It goes back to identifying those community needs. And I had to understand so clearly what the community needed. Not from me, but from the beat and the information. And it wasn't about what I needed as a reporter. It wasn't about getting my byline on the story or me being part of that conversation, but about providing a space for the community to have that conversation, because it was about them and it wasn't about me. And we got to that point by asking the right editorial questions. One more. Yeah.
I just had a question more about beat reporting in general. One of the things we struggle with is creating buy-in from the staff and enthusiasm for covering a beat. A lot of people just, kind of join and want to do general reporting. So, do you have any suggestions on how to sell it to create that buy-in, or how to structure beats to make them more appealing?
So I think part of it is it's worth thinking about, going back to these questions, what's interesting to you? So if you're covering something that you can't find anything interesting about, it's probably the wrong beat. Just to be blunt about it. I covered business very briefly when I was freelancing in California, and I just hated it. It was just, and I wasn't happy with it. Whereas I could cover this, or education, or politics, or policy, till almost the end of time. So I think that there's some degree of it's worth matching people up with beats that work for them that they find interesting. Now, granted, that's going to lead you probably to certain overabundance of beats that, depending on your staff, you may have one year where everybody just really wants to cover sports, or everybody really wants to cover, the administration and its malfeasance. So you have to think about that, but think through, try to also narrow your beats and try to find ways to reframe a beat. If it's not working for somebody, find a way to reframe it into something that means something to them, or that means something to other people. And then the other side of it is that when you find that, if you're meeting the community's needs, you'll get a lot of positive feedback, and that actually really helps pull you through a beat because you can see the impact of it.
When the community is involved with you on the coverage, that's infectious. And you begin to sense that your reporting has impact, which is what every reporter wants, right? And like Chris said, building the beat in a way that gets the community excited and involved with you, any reporter is going to jump on that. All right, well, thank you guys so much, and have a wonderful time over the next couple days.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
Sure.
you. We do have actually a few more minutes.
Okay.
It's scheduled till 11.
Okay.
So if you have a few minutes, I just was
Sure.
wondering if you might talk, obviously you talked about the editorial side of the site,
Mhm.
and I wonder if you might talk about the impact on individual families that have been served by this site. Something that is more personal, but it's just really important because that's...
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to pull up comment of the day?
Sure, you want to pull that up and I'll start talking a little bit. I mean, people ask about impact a lot, right? Because we ran the site for so long with just one reporter. Beyond that is a beat that the newspapers and news organizations, like I said, there were 17 crime reporters at the Post. Like, you'd think that this would happen. And because it wasn't, there was an assumption that, well, the community didn't need it. There wasn't a community interest. And almost immediately when we launched, people started coming to the site. I remember the first case we included on Homicide Watch DC was the death of a young woman named Ashley McCrae. And we had very few details about her when we started that story. Just that there'd been this shooting, I think it was in Southeast DC, and that a young woman had been killed and that the police hadn't identified her yet. This was a Saturday morning that I was writing this up. And it was our very first post, like nobody knew we existed. And a couple hours later, a comment came in from someone who said, you know, this was my friend, her name is Ashley, and here's her photo. So we put that information up on the website, and a couple people started coming to the site and leaving comments, which was really, really cool. About a year and a half later, a reporter was doing a story about Homicide Watch DC. The funny thing about covering homicides in DC is that, while very few people actually cover homicides, white people from California covering homicides in DC is newsworthy. So a lot of people wrote about us. And the detective in Ashley's case actually said that they had trouble solving the case. There was ultimately an arrest, but they'd had trouble getting to that arrest because she was killed in a neighborhood where she didn't live. But that they were ultimately able to solve it because somebody found Homicide Watch DC, which nobody knew about at that time, and saw her photo and saw her name and realized, I have information. And they picked up the phone and they called the police. And the detectives were ultimately able to make that arrest. This was week 1. And thinking about that now sort of gives me chills. Beyond that, this is a thread we keep called Comment of the Day. And now we get about 300,000 page views a month. Our time on site is about 7 minutes.
Yeah.
So that's really deep engagement. But we also still get a lot of comments. When we get a really good comment in particular, we pull that out and make it a comment of the day. So if you have time, I encourage you to just go through this thread. I'll tell you one more story, and that's, I think the comments probably buried pretty deep down here. But there is another young woman in my neighborhood where we lived, actually, named Lucky Pinnell. And Lucky was killed. She was sitting on her front porch with her best friend. She actually posted on Facebook just an hour or two before she was killed, sitting on my porch with my best friend chilling. And she was an 18-year-old senior at the local high school. This is her. And as soon as that shooting was reported, people started coming to Homicide Watch DC. And they started leaving information about her. R.I.P. Lucky, can't believe this was you. It was just a couple weeks ago that another comment came in, actually. And it's right here, this one. And this was on the 2-year anniversary of Lucky's death. I had no reason to remember that. We have, 92 homicide victims in DC last year, 108 or something the year before that. Lucky is just one of those numbers to me. But to her family, she is the one number that matters. And on the anniversary of her death every year, and her birthday, and Mother's Day, and different days like that, her family comes back to her page on Homicide Watch DC, and they leave comments. This one begins, "Oh, how my heart hurts today. 2 years, 3 suspects, no arrests. Why? I just really wish that people could solve their problems without violence. If they could, you'd still be here and would have experienced everything a high school senior should have. And it goes on to say, thank you so much, baby girl, for everything you brought to my life. I hope your killers do something positive with their lives while they can, because it's the only way to honor your memory. This comment, I think, is so representative of the way we can pull in the community, raise up their voices, and let them join in the conversation and the reporting with us. The 2-year anniversary of Lucky's death isn't a news story. It's not something I would have sent a reporter out to. But for her family, it was still a news event and a reminder of what's continuing in their lives and with this case. And when we can structure a beat around that need, again, going back to the needs of the community and identifying them, we allow these comments to rise up. And we respect the community by bringing their voices in and to letting them say in their own words what they hope happens. And that's better reporting than I could ever do by going out and asking questions. Yes?
How do you deal with the sensitive nature of these sorts of stories in terms of like the people involved and also yourself? Because I can imagine this can be an emotionally taxing thing to report on every day.
Yeah, I mean, just reading this comment, right? It's chilling inside. I'll start first with the self-care, which is what we call it in trauma coverage a lot. Everyone has their own techniques, and I really encourage if any of you are covering anything like this to go to the Dart Center website. It's a terrific resource. It includes not just information on self-care and keeping yourself healthy, but tips for and approaches for dealing with people in trauma, how to do those interviews, how to approach people. dartcenter.org, I believe. As far as dealing with interviews and sources and families, as a crime reporter, I'd have to go out to the story, right, to the scene of the crime or the courthouse or wherever it was.
This is back when you write a newspaper.
Exactly. And, the editors say, don't come back unless you have the quote, which I think is the wrong approach. When I started working on my own with Homicide Watch, I was able to say, okay, I can do it however I want. I don't have an editor telling me what to do. So what I started doing was asking people if they were comfortable in that moment talking to me. And I was able to give them an option. I'd like to talk to you about your son. Is this a good time? I'd like to talk about who he was. And start with an open-ended question like that. If they said no, I could give them a couple different options for talking to me. One, that it was fine not to talk to me. One thing we know on Homicide Watch is that it takes approximately 2 years from the time of an arrest for our case to go to trial. So I need a 2-year relationship with this family. That's a really long time, and I can't risk them getting angry with me on day one. But I could say, here's my card. You can call me later, next week, next month, later today, and we can talk. You can email me, and I can run your comments, much like this, as a comment of the day or a guest column. Would you like to write something about your son? Or, the story's going to be up. I'm here covering this preliminary hearing. I am going to be reporting on this. If you'd like to read the story and leave a comment at the end, I'd really welcome that and love to hear from you. So I try to put the power in their hands of deciding how and when they want to interact with me.
add one little bit to that. So part of the reason we can do this and be flexible like this is that we're online only. Like the reason print editors will tell you don't come back to the newsroom without a quote is because they have a paper to fill tomorrow. They have an external deadline that they can't change. And if it's not in the paper tomorrow, it's the only way to get new information out when all you have is a newspaper is to print another newspaper. Because we're online, and because we have this 2-year time horizon with any case that we're covering, and we're covering a lot of cases, it means we can be a little bit asynchronous about this. We don't have to put out a newspaper tomorrow. If a comment comes in a month from now, it's still going to show up on this victim page, and somebody's always going to be able to find it. It means that snippet of information is immensely more valuable to us, and it's valuable for a much longer time because we don't have to work in this sort of 24-hour reset. We can build something that lasts forever.
And we were able to get to that point by building that framework around the beat, by deciding what was important, what those units of coverage were, what the community needed, and what our editorial question was. Yeah.
It's so great that you're able to cover like so many of these deaths. Do you have a sense of the percentage of like how many of these deaths you just can't report beyond the initial information you get, and like the ones that never go to trial?
Yeah, I mean that's a
track
good
down the
question.
family?
You can look it up, but it's you can look at if you look at the list of victims, it'll tell you which ones have an arrest, and there are some that don't.
Go to this one here, baby Shannon.
Oh yeah.
This was an baby that remains unidentified. This little girl was found on a doorstep in the freezing cold of winter, and she died that evening that she was found. She remains unidentified. The police don't know who she is. They don't know where she came from, and there haven't been any arrests in the case. This is perhaps not, an exact example because we actually do have, a good amount of coverage in this case because it is so unusual, thankfully. But this is a case that we know very little about. And in this case, what we don't know, but there are so many questions, is just as important as if there was a lot of information. There are cases, shooting at 2 a.m. During a craps game in Northeast DC where, a 22-year-old is killed. Sometimes those cases just, we just get the initial report, nothing happens and nothing happens and nothing happens. When something does happen, when there is an arrest made, we're ready for it, even if it's 2 years down the line. And that's why we built the site the way it is. Yeah.
Who do you think will mostly read your crime reports?
That's a good question. A researcher from Australia actually did a study about 1.5 years ago.
Yeah.
It was a much larger community than I think anyone really expected. If you think about who a homicide affects, the innermost circle is the person killed and the person who committed the crime. They have family, they have friends, they have coworkers, they have people they meet at the grocery store, they have people they ride the bus with, and the circle just starts getting larger and larger. That's a much bigger circle than we imagined. It's teachers, it's social workers, it's the doctors and nurses in the emergency rooms who treat these patients as they come in. One of my favorite comments of the day actually came from an emergency room nurse who left a comment saying, "I want the family to know we did everything we could." That nurse doesn't have a way to talk with that family. The nurse doesn't know the family, and the family doesn't know the nurse. In an emergency room, there's many people who might have worked to try to save that young man. But this nurse felt like she wanted to say something to the family. and she was able to come to Homicide Watch to do it. And that's, when we think about who the audience of Homicide Watch is, I don't know that we would have included that nurse when we made that initial list of who reads the site. And in a place like DC, when you start including the nurses, the teachers, the bus drivers, the cashiers at the grocery store, that circle becomes very, very large, very, very quickly. All right. Well, we'll close up for the second time. Again, have a wonderful time learning.